The coffee shop on Maple Street smelled like burnt caramel and judgment. Marcus Sterling hadn't even sat down before Jennifer Whitmore cornered him by the pastry case, her designer handbag slung over her arm like a weapon. "We need to talk about your property," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. Jennifer never did. In the 6 months she'd been president of the Oakmont Heights HOA, she'd become a force of nature, the kind that destroyed everything in its path. Marcus turned to face her fully, trying to muster patience. He'd known Jennifer in high school. Back then, she'd been funny, almost human. Somewhere between then and now, ambition had calcified into tyranny. "Good morning to you too," he said, moving past her to order his coffee. "The well," Jennifer said, following him to the counter. "It has to go." Marcus froze. The barista, a college-aged kid named Trevor, suddenly became very interested in the espresso machine. "It's been there since 1947, Marcus said quietly. "It's on my property. It's not causing anyone harm." "It's a safety hazard," Jennifer countered, her voice taking on the rehearsed quality of someone who'd prepared this argument in the shower. "Unsightly. I've already fielded 3 complaints from neighbors about how it devalues the neighborhood aesthetic. It looks like something from a horror movie, Marcus. We're trying to maintain property values here." Marcus paid for his coffee. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the ceramic cup, making it glow. Everything in this moment felt too bright, too clear. He could see every pore on Jennifer's face, every thread in her tailored blazer, every manufactured concern in her expression. "No," he said simply. Jennifer's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "I'm sorry, was that a joke?" It wasn't a question, so it wasn't a no to a question. It was just a statement. "No, the well stays." "Marcus," Jennifer stepped closer, her voice dropping to the tone she probably used with her teenagers when they weren't living up to her standards. "I have the authority to force this. If you don't comply within 30 days, the HOA will file for." "Then file." Marcus turned away, moving toward a small table by the window. "I'll see you at the board meeting." He didn't see her face, but he felt her anger like heat radiating from a bonfire. Jennifer Whitmore was not a woman accustomed to being told no. That was part of her problem. One of many problems, actually, but that was the relevant one at this particular moment. The coffee tasted like nothing. Marcus's house had belonged to his grandmother first. She'd bought it in 1962, when the neighborhood was still mostly farmland, and the HOA was something people whispered about in concerned tones, but didn't truly believe would take root. His grandmother had loved that house with the kind of devotion usually reserved for children. She'd planted the magnolia trees that now towered over the property. She'd restored the Victorian porch, hand-painting the trim a deep forest green that Marcus had maintained scrupulously for the past 20 years. The well had been her pride and joy. When Marcus inherited the house, his grandmother had taken him by the hand. She was already in her 70s by then, her grip bird-fragile but determined, and led him to the well. It stood in the center of the back garden, a perfect circle of fieldstone, the wooden frame weathered silver-gray by decades of sun and rain. A rope, newer than the well by perhaps 30 years, wound around the wooden pulley. "This is the heart of the property," his grandmother had said. "Every well has a story. Most of the story of a place is underground." "Does it still work?" young Marcus had asked. He'd been maybe 10, more interested in the rope than the philosophy. His grandmother had smiled, that mysterious smile she'd worn when she was thinking about something distant. "It works in ways you don't understand yet. When you're older, when you really understand this house, you'll understand the well too." She'd died when Marcus was 17, before he'd gotten around to understanding either of them. The well had seemed like a relic then, something to preserve as memory rather than use. His parents had wanted to fill it in, seal it, get rid of it. But Marcus had convinced them to let it stand. He'd told them it was part of the history of the property. He hadn't mentioned that sometimes, on certain nights, he'd go out to the well and sit beside it and feel close to his grandmother in a way he couldn't explain. That was 23 years ago. The well had simply become part of the landscape of his life, something as natural and permanent as the magnolia trees, the Victorian porch, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property. You didn't think about it. It was just there, holding the shape of the world you'd grown up in. Jennifer Whitmore saw it as a problem that needed solving. The HOA board meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday evening. Marcus arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes early, and took a seat at one of the folding chairs arranged in a rough semicircle. The community center smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, that specific institutional aroma of a place that had hosted 1,000 different events, none of them particularly memorable. Jennifer was already there, of course. She was always already there. She sat at a small table with two other board members, Robert Chen, who owned the accounting firm 2 blocks over and seemed like a perfectly reasonable man who'd made the grave mistake of joining the HOA, and Diane Patterson, who was in her 70s and had once told Marcus she was mostly on the board because she had arthritis, and the community center had good air conditioning. About 30 people filtered in over the next 15 minutes. Marcus recognized most of them, neighbors he'd lived beside for varying lengths of time. Some smiled at him. Others deliberately looked away. Jennifer had probably got to them already, filling their heads with visions of a neighborhood in decline, property values plummeting, the social fabric unraveling because of one old well. Jennifer called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock. They got through the standard business, approval of minutes, discussion of a pothole on Elm Street, confirmation of the summer community barbecue. 15 minutes in, Jennifer pulled out a single sheet of paper and adjusted her glasses. "Now we have a matter of property maintenance that's been brought to my attention," she said, her voice taking on its public servant inflection. "Specifically, a structure on Marcus Sterling's property that poses a safety and aesthetic risk to the neighborhood." Marcus felt every eye turned toward him. This was a performance, he realized. Jennifer had invited him to this so she could make him the center of attention, so she could marshal community opinion against him. It was calculated. It was thorough. It was the kind of thing Jennifer did now. "The well on his property has been flagged by 3 separate residents as a concern," Jennifer continued. "It's unstable, it's unsightly, and frankly, it's dangerous. I've looked into our bylaws, and under Section 4, Paragraph C, the HOA has the authority to demand removal of structures that negatively impact neighborhood character and property values." "That's overstating it," Robert Chen said mildly. "The section says we can request removal if a structure is actively hazardous or in violation of zoning codes. An old well isn't technically a structure in the sense the bylaws mean." Jennifer's smile didn't waver. "The well is in violation of county building codes, actually. I checked. Any residential well requires current certification and regular inspection. This one has neither, so technically it is in violation." Marcus leaned forward. "My well is not a functional well. It hasn't drawn water since the 60s. It's a garden feature at this point, a historical feature." "Is it, though?" Jennifer turned to address the room rather than Marcus, which was her tell. She was winning in her mind, and now she was trying to consolidate her victory. "Is it really? Or is it just something that's become invisible to you because you've lived with it for so long? I would argue that it's a hazard. Someone could trip, a child could fall, and frankly, it brings down the tone of the entire street. I've been to neighborhoods with similar issues. Once one property begins to deteriorate, others follow. Before you know it, we're not Oakmont Heights anymore. We're just another suburban area where people don't care." The power of it was in the fear. Jennifer understood fear. She understood how to weaponize it. "I'd like to propose," Jennifer said, "that we give Marcus 30 days to remove the well. If he doesn't comply, we initiate formal HOA enforcement proceedings, which will include fines and a potential lien on his property." Marcus's chest tightened. A lien? She was willing to go that far over a well. "That seems extreme," Diane Patterson said, but she didn't sound convinced of her own argument. "It's not extreme," Jennifer said. "It's consistent with our covenants. This is about maintaining standards. We all agreed to those standards when we moved to Oakmont Heights. We all benefit from those standards in terms of property values and community reputation. If one person gets to opt out, then the whole system breaks down." Marcus stood up. 25 faces turned to look at him. "My family has lived in that house for 60 years, he said. "That well is part of our history. I'm not removing it because you find it aesthetically displeasing. If you want to fine me, fine me. If you want to put a lien on my property, go ahead, but the well stays." He walked out. Behind him, he heard Jennifer begin to speak. He didn't stay to hear what she said. The next morning, Marcus received an official letter. The HOA was formally requesting removal of the well within 30 days, effective immediately. Failure to comply would result in fines of $50 per day, escalating to a lien if the violation persisted for more than 60 days. $50 a day, 30 days would be $1,500, 60 days would be $3,000. Jennifer had done the math. She knew he wouldn't spend that much on a property dispute, not without resistance. She was banking on him breaking. Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the letter in front of him and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The sun was rising over the back garden, illuminating the magnolia trees in shades of gold and amber. He could see the well from here, pale stone against the dark green of the overgrown vines. His phone rang. It was his mother calling from her home in Connecticut. "Honey, Jennifer Whitmore just called me," his mother said without preamble. "She said you're refusing to remove the well and that you're being unreasonable about a community standard. What is going on?" Marcus closed his eyes. "She wants me to destroy a historic feature of the property to maintain neighborhood character. The well is fine. It's not hurting anyone." "Well, if the HOA wants it gone." "Mom." I know. You're being stubborn, just like your grandmother." His mother said this with a kind of resigned affection. She was stubborn, too. That well was always more important to her than being practical. Do you remember how she refused to put in air conditioning because it would damage the integrity of the Victorian architecture? "I remember." "You're just like her." His mother paused. "That's not always a good thing, Marcus. Sometimes you have to compromise." After he hung up, Marcus went out to the garden. He sat beside the well the way he used to sit there as a teenager, running his hand over the cool stone, feeling the history embedded in it. His grandmother had chosen this spot deliberately. Wells were placed in homes for a reason. They needed to be accessible but also protected. They needed to be near the house but separate from it. They needed to be at a certain depth to reach water. His grandmother had known something about this well. He was sure of it. He pulled up the rope that hung from the wooden frame. It was sturdier than it looked, the braided fibers still intact after decades of weather. The wooden pulley creaked as the rope moved, a sound that reminded him of old ships, of things that had survived longer than they had any right to. When he was about halfway down the rope, it reached the end. The rope was only about 30 feet long, not deep enough to reach the bottom of the well if it actually went that deep. Marcus had never really thought about it before. The rope was just there, like everything else. He felt a strange pull, something almost magnetic, drawing him toward answers. But he didn't have the tools to go deeper, and it was getting late. He wound the rope back up and went inside, making a mental note to buy a better rope, one that would reach farther down. That night he dreamed about his grandmother. In the dream, she was standing at the well, looking down into its darkness. When she turned to him, her face was sad. "Some things are buried for a reason," she said. "But if someone's threatening to destroy the well before you understand why, then maybe it's time to look." Marcus woke up at 3 in the morning with his heart pounding. The next Saturday, Marcus went to the hardware store and bought 200 feet of high-grade nylon rope, a powerful LED flashlight, and a canvas harness. He felt slightly ridiculous buying them. The hardware store clerk looked at him with the kind of expression people reserved for potential disasters. But he pushed through the embarrassment and bought them anyway. That afternoon, he set the rope up over the pulley, attaching the harness to his waist, and began to descend into the well. The walls were slicker than he'd expected, covered in a thin layer of moss and minerals that had built up over decades. The air got colder as he went deeper, and the smell changed, from earth to something older, something mineral and ancient. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stone walls in stark relief. About 40 feet down, the well opened up. Marcus stopped descending and played his flashlight across the opening. It was a cavity, a hollow space that seemed to extend back into the earth. He could see what looked like the entrance to a tunnel or possibly a small cave. The walls around it were different stone, not the field stone of the well itself, but something darker, something that might have been part of the original geological formation. His heart rate accelerated. This wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't on any survey, any property description, any historical record he'd ever seen. He descended another 10 feet and found himself in the cavity. His feet touched solid ground, not dirt, but stone, a sort of natural platform. He unhooked the harness and shone his light deeper into the tunnel. That was when he saw it. Light. Not his light, but a faint luminescence coming from deeper in the tunnel, as if something was glowing in the darkness. Marcus moved slowly, carefully, following the glow. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but it was probably only a few hundred feet. His breath echoed off the walls. He counted his steps, 50, 60, 70. At step 90, the tunnel opened up. He stepped into a chamber. It was roughly circular, about 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose up into shadow. But it was the contents that stopped his breath. The walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pinned and taped to the stone surfaces. They were old, decades old, some of them looking like they might date back to the 50s or 60s. They showed the neighborhood before it became Oakmont Heights. They showed families standing in front of modest houses. They showed children playing in streets that now had sidewalks. They showed the building of the shopping center, the widening of Maple Street, the gradual transformation of farmland into suburbia. And there, on one wall, was a series of photographs that made Marcus's breath catch. They were pictures of the HOA, but not the current HOA. These were older, faded color photographs from the 70s and 80s. Jennifer Whitmore's parents stared out of one of them, young and ambitious and cold. Standing beside them was Robert Chen's father, and in the center, unmistakable even at a younger age, was a woman Marcus recognized. He stepped closer. The photo was labeled, the text carefully handwritten beneath the frame. Oakmont Heights HOA Board 1983, the beginning. But it was the other photographs that made the chamber feel like it was spinning around him. They were photographs of the well, and they showed people, dozens of people, being brought to the well, being lowered into it, being left there in the darkness while the board members stood above ground, watching, waiting. The photographs were clinical, almost documentary in their precision. They looked like records, evidence. And there, in multiple photographs, standing with the HOA board members, was his grandmother. Her face was younger but unmistakable. She looked terrified. Marcus's hands were shaking as he took out his phone and started photographing everything. His mind was trying to fit the pieces together, trying to create a narrative from the photographs, but the pieces didn't fit. The images didn't make sense. They suggested something horrifying, something impossible. Then he saw it, a date written on one of the photographs, scrawled in fatting ink. July 15, 1982, 47 bodies disposed. Marcus stumbled backward, his phone slipping from his hands and clattering on the stone floor. He picked it up, hands trembling so violently he could barely hold it. The photographs continued, documenting years of something that his mind couldn't quite accept even as his eyes confirmed it. Row after row of faces disappearing into the darkness of the well. Row after row of names written on small cards, dates, initials, a simple X marked through each one. At the back of the chamber there was a stone table. On it lay a leather-bound journal preserved in the dry cave air. Marcus picked it up. The first entry was dated 1956. Marcus read the first few passages, then stopped reading. His grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable, flowing and elegant, documenting things that couldn't be documented, things that belonged in nightmares. He shoved the journal into his jacket pocket and ran. The police arrived at his house at 4 in the morning. There were 6 of them, 3 detectives, 2 uniformed officers, and Lieutenant Diana Reeves, who was the head of the state's Cold Cases Division. They came with a warrant to search the property, based on an anonymous tip that there might be evidence of serious crimes in the chamber beneath the well. They came with archaeological equipment and forensic specialists. They came with the knowledge that 52 people had gone missing from Oakmont Heights between 1956 and 1987, most of them homeless, undocumented immigrants, transient individuals whose disappearances had been noted in passing and then forgotten. By sunrise, they'd confirmed the presence of remains. By noon, the story was breaking on the local news. Major crime discovery in suburban Ohio neighborhood. Possible serial murders spanning decades. HOA community harbors dark history. By evening, every news outlet in the state was covering it. Jennifer Whitmore was brought in for questioning at 6 p.m. She arrived at the police station still wearing her morning tennis clothes, confusion and outrage radiating from her like heat. Marcus watched from the hallway of the station. He'd been brought in for his own statement, as Jennifer sat in an interrogation room and maintained repeatedly that she had no knowledge of any historical crimes. She knew nothing about the well. She had no idea what the chamber contained. She was a citizen of Oakmont Heights, a dedicated community member. She had nothing to do with anything that might have happened decades ago. "We know your mother was on the original HOA board," Detective Reeves said, sliding photographs across the table. These photographs show her involvement with at least 12 disappearances. Jennifer's face went very pale. My mother died in 1998, she said quietly. She never told me anything about that. If my family was involved in crimes, I knew nothing about it. But you did inherit her role in the HOA, Reeves continued. Your father passed it to you after she died. You understood that the position came with certain traditions, certain expectations. That's not, I was maintaining neighborhood standards, Jennifer said, and something in her voice cracked. That's all I was doing. I was trying to maintain standards. Marcus, listening from the hallway, felt something like pity cut through his shock and horror. Jennifer didn't know. She'd been following a playbook written by her parents, written by an entire community that had decided decades ago to turn a blind eye to something unspeakable. She'd inherited the role of maintaining the facade, and she'd been so good at it, so dedicated to maintaining standards, that she'd never questioned why the standards mattered so much. But that didn't explain why she'd pushed so hard for the well to be destroyed. That seemed like more than just maintaining the facade. Then Marcus realized she was trying to hide it. Somewhere along the way, maybe when she'd inherited the role, maybe when she'd taken charge of the HOA records, she'd found something. Perhaps a reference, a hint, something that suggested the well contained more than old stone and memory. And she decided the easiest way to manage the problem was to eliminate it entirely. She was trying to preserve her family's secret by erasing its evidence. The irony was almost unbearable. Over the next 2 weeks, the full story emerged in pieces, like an ancient artifact being excavated bit by bit. The well hadn't been chosen for its depth or its function as a source of water. It had been chosen for its connection to a natural underground cavity, a small cave system that the original developers of Oakmont Heights had discovered when they were laying the property foundations back in the late 40s. The cavity was documented in old geological surveys, but those surveys had been filed away, forgotten, classified as unimportant. But to a group of ambitious civic leaders in the mid-1950s, the cavity was an opportunity. Marcus found all of this in his grandmother's journal, which the police had photographed but returned to him after it had been cataloged as evidence. The journal was the real record, the true accounting of what had happened beneath the surface of Oakmont Heights for 3 decades. His grandmother had been a teacher. The journal entries from the early 50s showed a woman content with her life. She loved her job, she loved the house she'd bought, she was engaged to be married. She wrote about her fiancé, about the man she'd planned to spend her life with, about the future stretching before her bright with possibility. Then came the entries from 1956. The HOA had approached her. She was one of the young, educated women in the neighborhood, and they wanted her on the board. It was an honor, they'd said, a responsibility to maintain the community's character and standards. She'd accepted. Within weeks, she realized what the real purpose of the HOA was. The handwriting in the journal became frantic, the entries shorter and more desperate. She wrote about pressure from the board, particularly from Jennifer's grandfather, who'd served as chairman. She wrote about people disappearing from the neighborhood. She wrote about bodies being disposed of in the cavity beneath the well. And she wrote about why. They say it's about maintaining community values, one entry read. They say these people, the poor, the different, the ones who don't belong, are dragging us down. They say if we don't act, the neighborhood will become a ghetto. They say we're protecting property values. I try to tell them that property values don't matter if we're murderers. They laugh at me. They say I'm naive. They say this is how communities are protected. This is how America stays strong. Another entry from 1958. I asked Robert, my fiancé, if he knew what was happening. He said he didn't want to know. He said if I was smart, I wouldn't want to know either. He said some things have to be done quietly for society to function. When I told him I wanted to go to the police, he said I would be going to jail with him because his family is part of the board too. Silence or prison. Those were my choices. The entries grew darker. Marcus's grandmother documented bodies being brought to the cavity, documented the disposal, documented the careful cleaning that happened afterward. She documented Jennifer's grandfather giving orders, documented the ease with which people could simply vanish, documented the way police never asked too many questions. And then came the entry that broke Marcus's heart. It was dated June 3, 1963. The handwriting was barely recognizable, scrawled in what looked almost like a different person's hand, too large, too desperate. They killed him, they killed Robert. He wanted to leave. He said he was going to tell someone, so they killed him and put him in the well. They're telling everyone he ran off with another woman. No one is questioning it. No one will ever know. I'm completely alone now. They've made sure of it. The only way I survive now is if I stay silent. The only way I protect myself is if I help them, so I am going to help them. I am going to do what they ask, and I am going to die a coward. After that, the journal became a careful record, almost clinical. His grandmother documented the crimes in meticulous detail, as if creating a record, as if she was preserving the truth for someone to find later. Each entry listed names, dates, circumstances. She'd become the secretary of the organization that held her captive. Marcus could see what she was doing. She was documenting it. She was keeping a record so that someday someone could know the truth. She was creating evidence against herself, against the people who'd imprisoned her with guilt and complicity, evidence that might be found after she was gone. The final entry was dated December 25, 1987. 63 people, 63 souls. That is the count as of today. Most of them nobody missed. Most of them were the kind of people that society writes off as invisible. I have spent the last 31 years helping to erase them. I have spent 31 years as a murderer, not by action but by complicity. I am going to hide this record in the chamber. I am going to seal it in. And I am praying to a God I no longer believe in that someone will find it someday and know the truth. Even if that someone is my grandson, even if it damages my memory, even if it means I am damned for eternity. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to bear witness. I am leaving this for that person. I am leaving this for Marcus. I'm sorry, my darling boy. I'm sorry for the inheritance I'm leaving you. Marcus had cried when he read those final lines. He'd cried in the police station, in the presence of Detective Reeves, in front of everyone. He'd cried for the grandmother he'd loved, who'd been trapped in a nightmare of her own complicity. He'd cried for the 63 people erased from the world, noted in a ledger like a shopping list. He'd cried for his own stupidity in not understanding what his grandmother had been trying to tell him all those years. Most of the story is underground, she'd said, and she'd meant it literally. The investigation took months. Forensic teams excavated the cavity, working carefully to extract remains that had been preserved in the dry environment for decades. They identified 41 of the 63 bodies. The others had deteriorated beyond recognition or had been incomplete when disposed of. The remains were cataloged, documented, and eventually returned to families who'd been waiting decades for answers. There were memorial services. There were tears. There was a profound sense of a wrong finally being addressed, even if the perpetrators were almost all dead. Jennifer's grandfather had died in 1995, her mother in 1998. The other board members had passed away over the intervening years, their secrets intact until Marcus had opened the well. Jennifer herself was never formally charged with anything. There was no evidence that she'd participated in the crimes. There was significant evidence that she'd been trying to cover up the history of the well, but that wasn't technically a crime. That was more of a cultural choice, a terrible one, but not prosecutable. The HOA was dissolved. The community center was renamed. There was talk of memorializing the victims, of putting up plaques with their names, of transforming Oakmont Heights into a place that acknowledged what had happened beneath its surface. But what struck Marcus most was the silence that followed the initial revelations. People didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to acknowledge that their neighborhood, their safe suburban enclave, had been built on a foundation of murder and buried bodies. Some residents moved away. Others stayed but avoided the topic. It was as if everyone had made an unspoken decision to move forward to try to forget. It was, Marcus realized, the same decision his grandmother's generation had made 70 years earlier. It was the same choice Jennifer had been making when she demanded the well be destroyed. The impulse to hide, to deny, to maintain the facade. It ran deeper than he'd understood. 3 months after the discovery, Marcus stood in his kitchen and made a decision. He was going to destroy the house. The decision came to him fully formed, almost like something his grandmother was whispering through his subconscious. The house was beautiful. It was historic. It was beloved. It was part of his family's narrative. But it was also poisoned. Every room contained the knowledge of what had happened here, what his grandmother had endured, what the community had chosen to ignore. He couldn't live here anymore. He couldn't wake up in this house knowing what had happened beneath its surface. He couldn't tend the magnolia trees or maintain the Victorian porch or visit the garden without seeing the well, without seeing his grandmother's face, without hearing her final confession echoing through the rooms. The real estate agent tried to talk him out of it. "This is an important historical property," she said. "Even with the unfortunate history, there are buyers who would be interested in preserving it as a memorial or museum space." Marcus didn't want that. He didn't want the house to become a museum of murder, a place where people came to gawk at tragedy. He didn't want it to become a tourist attraction, a horror story, a true crime destination. He wanted it gone. He sold the property to a development company, and on a cold day in March, he stood across the street and watched the house be demolished. The Victorian porch came down first, the green trim catching the light as it fell. Then the walls, the roof, the historical architecture that had been so carefully preserved. And finally, the well. The excavator moved carefully, extracting the ancient stone, removing the wooden frame, filling the cavity beneath with cement, erasing the entrance that had hidden so much for so long. By sunset, Oakmont Heights was unrecognizable to Marcus. There was just a vacant lot where his grandmother's house had stood. The magnolia trees were gone. The green porch was rubble. The well was sealed forever. A young family bought the lot and built a new house. Nothing historic, nothing precious, just a perfectly ordinary suburban home with no memory attached to it, no secrets buried in its foundation. Marcus didn't attend the housewarming party. He'd already moved to a new apartment 3 towns away, somewhere that had no connection to his family history, no connection to the well, no connection to Oakmont Heights and its carefully maintained facade of normalcy. But the story didn't end there. 3 weeks after the house was demolished, Marcus received a visitor. It was Jennifer Whitmore. She looked smaller than he remembered, as if the weight of everything had physically diminished her. She stood on his apartment doorstep on a rainy evening, her designer handbag limp in her hands, her perfectly styled hair showing the first hints of gray at the roots. "I wanted to see you," she said without preamble. "I wanted to explain." Marcus almost closed the door. He almost told her there was nothing to explain, nothing to understand, nothing that could possibly bridge the gap between them. But something in her expression, a kind of desperate need to be heard, made him step back and let her inside. She sat on his couch and didn't take off her coat. Rain dripped from the fabric onto the upholstery, but neither of them seemed to notice. "I found out 6 months before I confronted you about the well," Jennifer said quietly. "I was going through old HOA records doing an audit. There were references to something in the historical documents, mentions of necessary measures and community protection. I didn't understand at first. Then I found the surveil, the geological survey of the property. It mentioned the cavity, and I put it together." She paused, staring at her hands. "I should have gone to the police immediately," she continued. "I should have told them everything I suspected, but I was thinking about my mother, about my father, about what it would mean if my entire family history was built on murder. I was thinking about the house I grew up in, the people I loved, the identity I'd built for myself, and I decided to hide it instead. I decided to destroy the well, to remove the evidence, to preserve the lie." "My grandmother never had that choice," Marcus said. "I know." Jennifer looked up at him and her eyes were red. "I know that now. I know what happened to her. I read some of the articles about the journal. I understand what she endured. And I understand that I tried to do the exact same thing she was forced to do, hide the truth, preserve the facade, protect the people I loved at any cost." Jennifer stood up. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for trying to force you to destroy that well. I'm sorry for trying to erase your family's history. And I'm sorry that by trying to cover up what happened, I ended up exposing it anyway. If I'd just let you alone, if I'd just left that well standing, none of this would have come out." "It would have come out eventually," Marcus said, but his voice was gentler now, recognition stirring in him. "My grandmother made sure of it. She left that journal specifically so the truth would be found." "Your grandmother was braver than me," Jennifer said. "She tried to create a record, I tried to destroy one." After Jennifer left, Marcus sat for a long time on his couch, watching the rain streak down the windows. He thought about his grandmother, about Jennifer, about the whole structure of complicity and silence that had held Oakmont Heights together for so many decades. The well had been trying to tell them all something. His grandmother had tried to listen, tried to create a record, tried to pass the burden of truth to someone who might handle it better than she had. And in the end, justice came not from silence, not from maintaining standards, but from the simple act of opening a sealed chamber and looking at what was inside. The state launched a full investigation into the HOA records, going back to its founding in 1956. What they discovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just Oakmont Heights. 3 other communities in the state had similar structures, similar cavities, similar disposal sites, similar ledgers maintained with meticulous detail by terrified community members. In each location, dozens of bodies were recovered. In total, across the 4 communities, the remains of 247 people were found. 247 murders spanning 40 years, hidden beneath suburban neighborhoods, orchestrated by HOA boards and local officials who decided that maintaining community standards was worth any price. The news cycle erupted into something Marcus had never seen before. The story became national, then international. International news outlets ran pieces about American suburban genocide and the dark side of community standards. Documentaries were fast-tracked into production. True crime podcasts began multi-episode investigations. And the lawsuits began. Families of the victims sued the municipalities, sued the developers, sued the estates of the deceased HOA members, sued the police departments that had turned a blind eye to the disappearances. Some of the cases were settled quickly, with communities desperate to avoid prolonged litigation. Others dragged on for years. Marcus found himself at the center of much of it. As the person whose discovery had triggered the investigation, he was called as a witness repeatedly. He attended depositions. He testified before grand juries. He gave interviews to journalists, to documentarians, to true crime podcasters who treated his family's tragedy like entertainment. It was exhausting, it was depressing, it was necessary. By the end of the first year, 3 police chiefs had been fired or forced to resign. The mayors of 2 of the communities had faced criminal charges for obstruction of justice. Several city council members had been implicated in the cover-up. Jennifer Whitmore received a settlement. The insurance company that covered the HOA agreed to pay her $500,000 to cover the costs of trauma therapy and to ensure her silence about the extent of her knowledge before the discovery. Marcus was offered $2 million by the municipality of Oakmont Heights. He accepted it, then donated it all to a fund for the families of the victims. He wanted none of it. He wanted none of this. He wanted to be able to go to a coffee shop without the barista recognizing him as the well guy. He wanted to be able to walk down a street without people stopping him to express their condolences, as if his family had been the victim of something rather than complicit in the victimization of others. But the world doesn't often offer people what they want. It offers what it offers, and you either accept it or you drown. The memorial service was held on a gray day in October, exactly 1 year after the well had been opened. 247 graves had been prepared in the city cemetery. 247 names had been engraved on a single black marble monument. 247 candles flickered in the cool autumn breeze. The families of the victims attended. They came from across the country, people who'd spent decades not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, not knowing where the bodies were, not having anyone to mourn, no grave to visit, no closure to achieve. Now they had both. The knowledge was a mixed blessing, terrible but final, terrible but true. Marcus stood apart from the crowd, watching the ceremony with Detective Reeves beside him. She'd become almost a friend over the course of the investigation, bonded by proximity to tragedy. "There's something almost obscene about this," Marcus said quietly, "treating this like a memorial when it's really just the end of a cover-up." "It's both," Detective Reeves said. "It's a terrible crime being acknowledged. It's a terrible crime being witnessed. That's not nothing." Jennifer Whitmore stood across the cemetery with her teenage children, whom she'd brought to understand the weight of their family's history. They looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Marcus didn't blame them. As Marcus watched, Jennifer caught his eye across the black marble monument. She nodded, a small, private gesture of acknowledgement. He nodded back. That was as close to peace as either of them would ever get. 2 years after the discovery, Marcus was contacted by a filmmaker named Sarah Chen. She wanted to make a documentary about the discovery, about the well, about Oakmont Heights, and the hidden history of suburban America. "I want it to be honest," she'd said when they met. "Not exploitative, not turning it into a spectacle, but honest about what happened, about why it happened, and about how communities like this came to exist." Marcus was hesitant. He was tired of talking about the well, but he agreed to work with her. The documentary took 2 years to film. It featured interviews with the families of victims, with Detective Reeves, with historians who'd studied suburban development and community formation. It featured Marcus, telling the story of his discovery, of his grandmother's journal, of the realization that his entire family history was entangled with murder. The documentary premiered at Sundance. It won awards. It sparked conversations about race, class, and the concept of community standards. It made people uncomfortable, which was the point. Sarah Chen's documentary was good. It was honest. It treated the 247 victims as people rather than statistics. It treated the perpetrators with a kind of ruthless clarity, neither demonizing them as inhuman monsters nor excusing them as victims of their time. It treated them as people who'd made terrible choices, who'd rationalized those choices in language that felt familiar and contemporary. That was what made it most disturbing, because the language they'd used, about protecting property values, about maintaining community standards, about keeping out undesirables, it was language that still existed, that still circulated through certain neighborhoods and communities, that still motivated policy and exclusion and violence. The well had been a specific historical horror, but it was rooted in patterns that persisted into the present. By the 5th year after the discovery, most of the lawsuits had been settled or adjudicated. The criminal cases had been tried. The investigations had concluded. The media attention had faded into occasional historical pieces on the anniversary of the discovery. Marcus had rebuilt his life in a new city, with a new job, with a carefully maintained distance from the trauma of what he'd discovered. He saw a therapist. He read books about intergenerational trauma. He tried to understand what it meant to be the heir to both complicity and the revelation of complicity. He was at a coffee shop, not the one where Jennifer had cornered him years ago, but a new place in a new city, when his phone rang. It was a lawyer from the law firm handling the cases for the families of the victims. "I wanted to give you a heads up," the lawyer said. "One of the victims' families has decided to go public with something that's been kept private up until now." "What is it?" Marcus asked. "One of the victims was your father's sister, your great-aunt. She disappeared in 1971 when she was 17. She was never reported missing because she'd been adopted, and her adoptive family didn't report her to the authorities. But your father's biological family has had records of her disappearance all these years. They're planning to make that public, to connect your family's complicity in the crimes to your family's loss." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. "I wanted to warn you, because the story is going to create a narrative that—" "She was my great-aunt," Marcus interrupted. "Yes, her name was Catherine Sterling. She lived with your paternal grandparents briefly before she was placed for adoption. When she disappeared, no one in your family knew that she'd ended up in the area. But the records indicate that she was taken to Oakmont Heights, placed in the well, and—" Marcus hung up. He sat in the coffee shop with his untouched coffee growing cold in front of him, trying to process the information. His great-aunt had been one of the 247. She'd been in the well. She'd been part of the system that his grandmother had helped operate. Which meant that his grandmother had participated, however unwillingly, in the death of her husband's sister. His great-aunt had died because of the system that his grandmother had helped maintain. She died in the cavity beneath the well that had been trying to tell everyone the truth. When he finally went home that evening, Marcus pulled up the documentary. He watched the scene where they memorialized the 247 victims, where the names were read aloud over footage of the black marble monument. When they reached Catherine Sterling, Marcus paused the video. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he called his father. Marcus's father didn't remember Catherine. He'd been young when she disappeared, too young to understand adoption or family complications, or the fact that a person could simply vanish from existence. He'd grown up with a sister named Catherine who lived in another state, and was someone he'd never met. He'd never questioned it. "What do you mean she was one of the victims?" his father said, his voice cracking over the phone. Marcus explained everything. How Catherine had ended up in Oakmont Heights, how the records had been found, how she died in the well beneath his own grandmother's house. He explained what his grandmother had endured and done, what the original HOA board had perpetrated. There was a long silence. "You're telling me," his father said finally, "that your grandmother was part of the system that killed my sister." "Your grandmother was a victim of the system too," Marcus said, and immediately regretted it. He didn't want to excuse his grandmother. He didn't want to create a hierarchy of victimhood. He wanted his father to understand the complexity, and he knew that complexity wasn't helpful right now. "I don't care," his father said flatly. "I don't care if she was a victim. She was part of the machine that murdered my sister. That's the relevant fact." The next day, Marcus's father went on every news outlet that would have him. He gave interviews. He wept on television. He talked about his sister, Catherine, who'd been 17 when she disappeared, who'd struggled with mental illness and substance addiction, who'd been placed with adoptive parents who'd eventually given up on her, who'd ended up homeless and in the wrong place at the wrong time. "My father's mother was complicit in her death," he said during an interview with a major news network. "My grandmother participated, however reluctantly, in the murder of my sister, and I've spent my entire life not knowing that. I've spent my entire life as the heir to a murderous history that I was kept ignorant of. If we're going to have an honest reckoning with what happened, we need to understand that the silence, the not knowing, the choice to look away, that's part of the system too." The interview went viral. Within 48 hours, the story was everywhere. The well discovered because of HOA demand, but the discoverer's own gray-tant was a victim. Marcus's life became circus again. Journalists called. He was asked for statements. He was asked to defend his family, to explain the inexplicable, to create a narrative that would allow people to understand all of this. He didn't answer the calls, he didn't give statements, he stayed silent. Jennifer Whitmore, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. She'd been trying to live quietly, to move forward, to be the person who'd made a mistake, and was now trying to do better. But now that the full scope of the crimes and the complicity had been revealed, she found herself targeted by advocacy groups and journalists who saw her as a symbol of the kind of generational silence that had perpetuated the murders. One of the news outlets ran a piece titled, "Karen Wants to Forget, Why We Can't Let Jennifer Whitmore Move On." It made her sound like a monster. The interviews with her were framed to make her look callous, indifferent to the victims. But when Marcus saw her interviewed on one of the evening news programs, he recognized the fear in her eyes. She was being held accountable, which was appropriate. But she was also being used as a symbol of something much larger, much more systemic, which was less appropriate. "I was wrong," Jennifer said during the interview, her hands trembling visibly. "I was wrong to try to hide the well. I was wrong to push Marcus to destroy it. And I was wrong about my family. I'm trying to understand how that happened, how good people, or at least people who tried to be good, could participate in something so evil. But I don't think the answer is to just punish me and then move on. I think the answer is to understand how this could happen in the first place." The interviewer looked skeptical. "Your mother was directly involved in at least 12 murders." "I know," Jennifer said quietly. "And I'm trying to accept what that means about my family, about my own inheritance of guilt, even though I wasn't personally responsible. But I'm also trying to understand that you can acknowledge that without turning yourself into a symbol. You can acknowledge terrible guilt without becoming a cartoon villain." Marcus and Jennifer met for coffee. It was the first time they deliberately arranged to see each other since her visit to his apartment. They met at a neutral coffee shop in a city neither of them lived in, Cincinnati, a place where they could disappear into anonymity for an afternoon. Jennifer looked older. She had circles under her eyes, and her hair had gone almost completely gray. She'd stopped maintaining the level of perfection that had defined her HOA presidency. She looked like a real person now, which somehow made her more sympathetic and more vulnerable. "I saw your father's interview," Jennifer said without preamble. "I saw that your gray-tant was one of the victims." "Yes," Marcus said. "I'm sorry, I don't even have words for how sorry I am." "Are you," Marcus asked, not unkindly, "or are you just performing sympathy for someone who's been harmed?" Jennifer flinched. "Both, maybe. I'm genuinely sorry, but I'm also aware that my sympathy doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring her back." They sat in silence for a moment. "I've been thinking about your grandmother," Jennifer said finally. "About what she endured. My mother kept a personal diary. The police got it as part of the investigation. In it, she wrote about your grandmother, about the pressure they put on her, about the fact that they basically held her hostage with the threat of exposing her complicity if she didn't continue to cooperate. Your grandmother was trapped." "I know," Marcus said. "I read her journal. I understand what happened to her." "But I don't think you understand," Jennifer said quietly, "that what they did to her was also being done to me, not physically, not in the same way, but psychologically. When I took over the HOA presidency, my mother gave me those files. She didn't explain what was in them. She just said I needed to maintain the neighborhood standards and that some things were better left alone. It took me 6 months to understand what I was looking at. And then I was trapped too. Not by direct threats, but by the weight of family history, by the understanding that exposure would destroy my family's reputation, by the terrible knowledge that I could either protect that history or I could expose it. "You chose to protect it," Marcus said. "I did, and that was wrong. But I did it for the same reasons your grandmother protected it: fear, complicity, the terrible weight of knowing things you can't unknow." Marcus wanted to argue with her. He wanted to tell her that she'd had a choice when his grandmother didn't, that the circumstances were incomparable, that she didn't get to claim victimhood in the same way his grandmother could. But sitting there, looking at her face, he realized something. Jennifer had made a terrible choice. She'd tried to hide the truth, but she'd also been trapped by the same system of complicity that had trapped his grandmother. She'd been raised in it, groomed into it, expected to perpetuate it. And when she'd pushed Marcus to destroy the well, she hadn't been being malicious. She'd been being desperate. She'd been trying to do what her mother had trained her to do, make the problem go away. That didn't excuse what she'd tried to do, but it explained it. "I don't forgive you," Marcus said finally. "I know," Jennifer said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to understand how this happened and to make sure it doesn't happen again in my lifetime. That's all any of us can do." After Jennifer left, Marcus sat in the coffee shop for another hour. He thought about his grandmother, trapped and complicit, documenting the truth because she couldn't fight it any other way. He thought about Jennifer, raised in the shadow of that complicity, trying to continue the cover-up because she didn't know how to do anything else. He thought about Catherine Sterling, 17 years old and struggling with addictions and homelessness, vulnerable enough to become a target, unknown enough that her disappearance could be hidden away. He thought about the 247 people whose disappearances had been erased, whose murders had been hidden, whose families had been left with nothing but uncertainty for decades. And he thought about the fact that the story didn't end with his discovery, didn't end with the excavation of bodies, didn't end with convictions or lawsuits or documentaries or memorials. The story was ongoing. The story was still being written in the form of how communities chose to remember or forget, how families chose to reckon with their history or deny it, how individuals chose to tell the truth or stay silent. His grandmother had chosen truth, even if it took decades. Jennifer was choosing accountability, even if it was uncomfortable and painful. His father was choosing to honor his sister's memory, even though that meant publicly confronting his family's complicity. Those choices mattered. They didn't erase the murders, they didn't bring the victims back, but they mattered in a way that continued silence never would. 3 years after Catherine's family went public with their connection to one of the victims, Marcus received a letter from a law firm he didn't recognize. The letterhead was from Boston, and the letter was addressed to Marcus Sterling, heir to the Sterling family property records. He almost threw it away, but something made him open it. Inside was a request to appear for the reading of a will. Apparently, a man named Robert Sterling Jr., Marcus's great-uncle, Catherine's adoptive brother, had died, and he had left a bequest specifically to Marcus. Marcus had never met Robert Sterling Jr. According to the sparse genealogical information Marcus had, Robert had been 20 years older than Catherine, had lived his entire adult life in Boston, and had never been particularly close to the rest of the Sterling family. But he'd apparently been keeping track of Marcus. The will reading took place in a lawyer's office in downtown Boston. Marcus attended alone, sitting in a conference room with the family lawyer and several older documents that Robert Jr. had requested be presented to Marcus in person. The bequest itself was modest, $10,000 and a set of letters. The letters were from Robert Jr. to Marcus, though they'd never been sent. They were dated over the course of 30 years, starting in 1994 and ending in 2024, just weeks before Robert Jr.'s death. Marcus opened the first letter with shaking hands. "Dear Marcus," it read, "I've never met you, but I feel as though I know you because I know your story in a way that most people don't. I know what happened to Catherine, and I know that you discovered what happened to her, and I know the weight that discovery has placed on you. This letter is meant to be read only after my death, because while I was alive, I didn't have the courage to make contact with you. I hope you can forgive me for that." Robert Jr. went on to explain his history. He'd been adopted into the Sterling family in 1952, taken in as an orphan. Catherine had been adopted in 1954, just 2 years before she disappeared. He'd been 12 when she vanished, old enough to remember her but young enough to be told that she'd run away, that she was troubled, that she'd been better off living elsewhere. For 40 years, he'd believed that story. Then his adoptive mother had died, and in going through her belongings, he'd found a newspaper clipping about the discovery in Oakmont Heights. There had been a photograph of the well, and something about it had triggered a memory, a suppressed memory, he supposed, of Catherine talking about a place called Oakmont Heights, talking about meeting someone from there, talking about considering moving there. He'd put the pieces together. He'd contacted the investigators. He'd confirmed his sister's remains were in the collection that had been recovered. And then he'd done nothing with that information for 30 years. The second letter was dated 1998. I had the opportunity to contact your family many years ago when your grandmother's journal was first being analyzed as evidence. I could have told them about Catherine. I could have helped make the connection between my sister and my great-nephew. But I was afraid. I was afraid of disrupting your life, of imposing the weight of my sister's murder on you, of being the person who brought terrible knowledge to your door. So I stayed silent. I watched from a distance. I kept track of you through the years, your career, your life, the evidence that you were living something approaching normal existence despite the tragedy that had touched your family. And I told myself that I was respecting your privacy by not contacting you. But I realize now that I was respecting my own comfort, not your dignity. I was choosing to carry the burden of my sister's death alone rather than sharing it with the family that had a right to know. That was a cowardly choice, and I've spent the last 30 years regretting it. The letters continued, each one revealing a piece of Robert Jr.'s internal struggle. He'd been in therapy for decades, processing the guilt of being an adopted child who survived, while Catherine, the sister he barely remembered, had been murdered. He'd been haunted by questions about whether their adoptive mother had known something about Catherine's vulnerability, about whether there had been warning signs he'd missed. But in the later letters, something shifted. Robert Jr. wrote about accepting his limitations, about understanding that he couldn't change the past, about finding meaning in bearing witness to what had happened. The final letter was dated just 3 weeks before Robert Jr.'s death. Marcus, I'm writing this knowing that I don't have much time left. I have stage 4 cancer, and my doctors have given me perhaps a month. In that month, I will die, and I will take with me the life experience of being Catherine's brother, of knowing what happened to her, of carrying the weight of that knowledge for so long. I'm leaving you these letters because I want someone to know my part of this story. I want someone to understand that the ripples of what happened in Oakmont Heights extended farther than anyone realized, reached people like me who were trying to live normal lives but couldn't escape the gravity of that tragedy. I want to tell you something, though, that might help. For decades, I carried my silence as though it were a burden I had to bear. I thought my silence was noble, was protective, was appropriate. But I've come to understand that my silence was just another form of the silence that allowed those murders to happen in the first place. You broke that silence. You discovered the well. You opened the chamber. You revealed what needed to be revealed. I could have done that 30 years ago. I could have been part of that revelation, but I didn't. That's my failure. That's my regret. I hope this letter helps in some small way. I hope it helps you understand that by breaking silence, by telling the truth, by refusing to be complicit in the cover-up, you did exactly what needed to be done. Catherine deserved to be known. She deserved to have her death acknowledged. You gave her that. That's more than I ever managed to do. With deep respect, Robert Sterling Jr. Marcus left the law office in Boston feeling hollowed out. He found a hotel near the airport and checked in without any plan to leave. He lay on the bed in the dark and read and reread Robert Jr.'s letters, trying to understand what they meant, what they were asking of him. The $10,000 was still in the envelope. It represented more than money. It represented Robert Jr.'s attempt to make amends for 30 years of silence, to pass forward the responsibility of bearing witness, to say that Marcus had done something important and that it had mattered. But it also represented something else. It represented the fact that the story of the well wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about Catherine. It was about Robert Jr. It was about his grandmother. It was about all the people who'd been touched by the crimes and by the cover-up and by the terrible choice between speaking truth and maintaining silence. The next morning, Marcus made some phone calls. He contacted Catherine's adoptive family, the relatives that his great uncle had kept track of. They agreed to meet with him. He spent the next week in Boston, meeting with people who'd known Catherine, who'd been devastated by her disappearance, who'd finally received answers but were still processing the knowledge. One of them was Catherine's adoptive brother, Michael, Robert Jr.'s biological brother, adopted into the same family, now in his 70s. He took Marcus to a small cemetery in suburban Boston where Catherine had a memorial grave. No actual remains because those were in Ohio, but a space to mourn her. "Robert never told us about you," Michael said, standing in front of Catherine's grave. "He kept so much of this to himself. I wish he'd shared it with us. I wish he'd let us help him carry it." "He was protecting you," Marcus suggested. "The way people do." "I know," Michael said. "That was his way. He was always the one who absorbed the pain so the rest of us wouldn't have to. But that's not real protection. That's just isolation dressed up as kindness." They stood in silence for a while. "Catherine was funny," Michael said eventually. "She was troubled, yes. She struggled with things that were beyond any of our family's capacity to help her with. But she was funny and kind, and she loved terrible movies and bad jokes, and she had this way of making people feel seen. That's what I want people to know about her when they think about this case. Not just that she was murdered, but that she was a real person with a real personality with qualities that mattered." Marcus returned to his life 3 weeks later, but something had shifted. He understood now that the story of the well wasn't ever going to be complete, wasn't ever going to reach a satisfying conclusion. There would always be new information, new victims to identify with, new family members emerging from the past with their own stories of loss and silence and the terrible weight of not knowing. But there could be healing, not forgetting, not moving on exactly, but moving forward while carrying the weight of the truth, while honoring the memory of the victims, while ensuring that the silence never fully returned. He started a foundation in Catherine's name, dedicated to supporting homeless and at-risk youth. He used Robert Jr.'s $10,000 as seed funding, then donated a significant portion of the settlement money he'd received from the municipalities. Jennifer Whitmore volunteered with the foundation. It was awkward at first, then gradually became natural. They found themselves working toward a common purpose, not forgetting what had happened, but ensuring that the circumstances that had allowed those murders to occur would never recur. Marcus didn't forgive Jennifer for trying to destroy the well, but he came to understand her in a way that made forgiveness feel less important than understanding. 5 years after the discovery of the well, the city of Oakmont Heights unveiled a new memorial site. They'd preserved the remains of the property where Marcus's grandmother's house had stood. Instead of building a new home, they'd created a memorial garden. The space featured a black marble wall, similar to the one at the cemetery, with the names of all 247 victims engraved into its surface. A stone bench sat before the wall, positioned so visitors could sit and read the names. Around the bench, they'd planted flowering shrubs and perennials that bloomed in waves throughout the season. The effect was intentional. The memorial was not a place of mourning that looked like mourning. It was beautiful. It was intentionally, deliberately beautiful because the victims deserved beauty, deserved to be remembered in spaces that reflected the complexity of their humanity rather than just their deaths. The dedication ceremony was held on a sunny day in June. Families of victims attended. City officials attended. Media attended. And Marcus attended, standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching as names were read, as tears were shed, as flowers were laid. Jennifer Whitmore was there too, seated with representatives from the foundation she'd helped Marcus establish. She didn't approach him. They'd developed a kind of professional relationship over the years, cordial but defined by boundaries, by the acknowledgement that they'd been on opposite sides of an important conflict, but had come to some kind of understanding. The mayor of Oakmont Heights stepped to the microphone. She'd been elected after the previous mayor's resignation, elected on a platform of transparency and reckoning with the city's past. "We gather today," she said, "to acknowledge what happened in this neighborhood. For 40 years, 247 people were murdered. For 30 years after the murders stopped, the crimes were hidden. For decades after that, the knowledge sat beneath our feet, in a cavity beneath the earth, waiting for someone to look. That someone was Marcus Sterling. Marcus discovered what had been hidden. He opened a well and revealed secrets that this community had tried very hard to forget. Some of you are probably thinking that if the well had never been opened, we'd all be more comfortable. We could have continued to live in our neighborhoods without this terrible knowledge, without this guilty knowledge of what happened here. But I want to propose something different. I want to propose that what happened here is exactly what we needed to know. That bearing witness to terrible things, even when that bearing witness is painful, even when it disrupts our comfort, even when it forces us to reckon with the fact that we benefited from a system of violence, that bearing witness is crucial. It's necessary. The victims whose names are engraved on this wall deserve to be known. They deserve to have someone care enough to look for them, to find them, to honor their memory. Marcus Sterling did that, regardless of the personal cost. We're not here today to close a chapter. We're here to say that the chapter has been opened, and we're going to keep it open. We're going to remember. We're going to teach the next generation about what happened. We're going to ensure that this kind of systemic violence never takes root in our community again. The mayor placed a wreath of flowers at the base of the black marble wall. Others followed, families and strangers alike, each leaving their own small tribute to the 247 names. Afterward, Marcus stood alone in front of the wall and read his gray-tant's name. Catherine Sterling, 1950-41971, remembered. He thought about what his grandmother had endured, what she'd tried to communicate through the journal, what she'd been trying to pass down to him. He thought about the way that terrible truths, once revealed, could never fully be hidden again. There would be attempts to deny it, to minimize it, to move on without fully processing it. But the truth would persist, like a stone dropping into still water, the ripples extending outward in ever-widening circles. Jennifer approached him slowly, carefully, as if approaching an animal that might bolt. "Catherine was the key, wasn't she?" Jennifer said quietly. "Robert Jr. kept track of you because you were Catherine's connection to the discovery. If Robert had come forward 30 years ago, this would have been revealed 30 years ago. None of this would have unfolded the way it did." "Maybe," Marcus said. "Or maybe it would have been covered up, and I would never have known to look in the well in the first place." "Or maybe," Jennifer said, "the timeline was exactly as it needed to be. Robert carried the knowledge for 30 years and then passed it to you through those letters. You discovered the well because my trying to destroy it made you want to understand why it mattered so much. Terrible things led to the revelation of terrible things, which led to justice." "I'm not sure it's justice," Marcus said, looking at the wall. "Most of the people responsible are dead. We punished a few officials. We settled lawsuits. But the 247 people are still dead. Their families are still grieving. The only thing justice really is in a situation like this is acknowledgement. It's bearing witness. It's refusing to forget." Jennifer nodded slowly. "Your grandmother would be proud of you, I think, for refusing to let this be forgotten." "My grandmother would be horrified by what she participated in," Marcus said. "That's the gift she left me, the knowledge of her own horror at what she'd done, documented in her journal. She spent 30 years in hell, carrying the weight of complicity, trying to create a record so someone could know the truth. I think she'd be grateful that I found the well and opened it. But she'd be devastated by the knowledge of what happened." "Yes," Jennifer agreed. "I think so too." They stood in silence for a moment, two people who'd started as adversaries and had ended up as witnesses to each other's reckoning with unbearable truths. "What will you do now?" Jennifer asked. "Keep working with the foundation," Marcus said. "Keep trying to make sure that what happened here, both the murders and the cover-up, becomes part of how we understand suburban development, community formation, the ways that good intentions can be corrupted into systemic evil. Keep telling stories about the victims, about the people who died, about the people who have been carrying the knowledge." "And with me," Jennifer asked, "with us?" Marcus thought about that. He thought about forgiveness and accountability and the possibility of moving forward while remaining connected to the past. "I think," he said finally, "that we keep doing what we've been doing. We acknowledge what happened. We try to ensure it doesn't happen again. We listen to the people who are still grieving. And we remember that we could have chosen differently, but we didn't." "That's fair," Jennifer said. She left him there, standing in front of the memorial wall, reading the names of the 247 people who'd been murdered, hidden, and finally remembered.